everybody, Max Scoble here for IGN. Fallout 4 is finally happening, and we get to play it sometime soon, but not quite yet. So in the meantime, here is a bunch of stuff that can keep you entertained while you're waiting for it. Let's get this out of the way. If you're into Fallout and you haven't heard about the Mad Max films, I hope you've been living in an underground vault for your entire life because there's literally no other excuse. This is the definitive post-apocalyptic movie series, and each entry is great in its own way. Technically, the first Mad Max does take place after a nuclear war, but society's still sort of in place, so if you're after that crazy Wasteland Raider stuff like you see in Fallout, check out Road Warrior, Beyond Thunderdome, or Fury Road. They're all sequels, but they totally work fine as standalone movies, so give it a shot. A lesser-known but equally influential piece of post-apocalyptic fiction is A Boy and His Dog, which follows a very randy teenage Don Johnson wandering the waste with a dog who can communicate telepathically, the two of them trying to meet girls before eventually finding themselves with some weird folks who live in an underground bomb shelter. Given the prominent role of the dog in Fallout 4, I would say that folks at Bethesda definitely took some notes here. Stanley Kubrick's classic film Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, is probably the most beloved black comedy about Cold War paranoia and dangers of nuclear war. It's one of those movies that has had so many homages paid to it in various other forms of popular culture that seeing it for the first time at this point might feel kind of like a deja vu, but it holds up really, really well. Also, keep an eye out for James Earl Jones in his first ever feature film role. If you want something a bit more on the goofy side of post-apocalyptic, one of my personal favorites is Hell Comes to Frogtown. Rowdy Roddy Piper plays notorious highwayman Sam Hell, who also happens to be one of the last fertile men on Earth, so he's been enlisted to help repopulate the Earth. But there's one catch. All of the women capable of bearing children have been kidnapped by mutant frogmen and taken to their stronghold, the titular Frogtown. This movie is definitely reminiscent of some of Fallout's goofier moments. The original Twilight Zone was one of the first shows to expose television audience to high-quality speculative fiction. It was usually more horror than science fiction, but a few episodes tackled the theme of what came after an apocalypse. Time at Last is a famous episode that revolves around nuclear catastrophe taking place while one guy is conveniently hiding in a vault. Another, simply titled 2, is about a man and a woman meeting in a completely deserted post-apocalyptic city, which is full of imagery that should be very familiar if you're a fan of Fallout. So much of what makes Fallout unique is its retro-futuristic repurposing of America's 1950s Cold War paranoia and the tongue-in-cheek way that it pokes fun at that era's naivete, in spite of the fact that at one point nuclear war was a very serious national concern. These aren't by any means post-apocalyptic, but there are a couple comedies that also poke fun at that time period. The first is Blast from the Past, which stars Brendan Fraser as a man who spent most of his life in a fallout shelter under the impression that there was a nuclear war, but then making his way outside in the late 1990s. It's sort of like Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt, but with references to the 50s instead of the 80s and 90s. Another movie that tells an anachronistic fish-out-of-water story about the 1950s is Pleasantville, but it goes the opposite direction. Tobey Maguire and Reese Witherspoon have been magically trapped in an old sitcom in the style of Leave It to Beaver or Father Knows Best, and they're forced to play along. It's basically a way less creepy version of the Tranquility Lane mission from Fallout 3. If late 90s teen comedies aren't your cup of tea, then perhaps you're more fond of ultra-violent Japanese anime from a decade prior. Fist of the North Star is basically a cross between Mad Max and Dragon Ball Z. A bunch of muscle-bound, leather-clad dudes in a nuclear wasteland scream a lot and punch each other until they literally explode into guts. It's awesome. The long-running anime series was based on a popular manga and has spun off into several animated movies and miniseries, novels, games, and even a live-action American feature film, so that can be a bit overwhelming if you're trying to find a good starting point, but you're probably pretty well off with the 1986 anime movie. If you're in the market for some comics that are in line with Fallout's retro-futurism, check out Manhattan Projects. It's an ongoing series from Image Comics, which will probably sit well with history buffs. It's a very weird alternate reality version of World War II, where in addition to inventing the atomic bomb, American scientists are dabbling in all kinds of other fantastical and terrifying super science. It's somewhere between Wolfenstein, the Venture Brothers, and Dr. Strangelove. That is an ongoing series from Image with back issues collected in several trade paperback volumes, which shouldn't be too hard to track down. But if you're willing to dig a little bit deeper into the back issues, one short-lived series that I grew up reading was DC's Hex. It took their classic cowboy character, Jonah Hex, who you might recall being in a terrible Megan Fox movie, but pulled him out of the Wild West and sent him hurtling into the distant future, where he wandered a scorched earth full of biker gangs, acid rain, and giant worms. It only went on for 18 issues because honestly, it's actually really ridiculous, but DC would be crazy not to reprint it given that between Fallout and Mad Max, campy post-apocalyptic antics are pretty hot in 2015. If you are a reader of those old-fashioned non-comic books that have less pictures and way more words, there is absolutely no shortage of post-apocalyptic fiction for you to chew on, but this is a video and there's less to show on screen when talking about books, so let me just give you a few of these rapid fire. The Last Babylon by Pat Frank came out in 1959 and follows the events in a small Florida town after nuclear war breaks out and society gradually starts to crumble. John Lennon from The Beatles was a huge fan of this book because of his anti-war views. A Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter M. Miller Jr. was released in 1960, but takes place 600 years after after a nuclear war and chronicles, among other things, the surviving population's backlash against technology and science, and an order of monks dedicated to preserving and archiving the remnants of human history in spite of this. Not unlike the Brotherhood of Steel from Fallout, just, much less power armor. The 1997 Kevin Costner film The Postman was horribly received, but the 1985 David Brin novel it was based on is well regarded in terms of sci-fi. A dude survives a major global catastrophe by hiding in a mail truck and proceeds to deliver mail. Along the way, he encounters survivalist militias and super intelligent computers. The usual. You might be familiar with the post-apocalyptic games Metro 2033 and Metro Last Light. Well, those were actually based on a Russian novel by Dmitry Glukovsky, also called Metro 2033. Finally, Cormac McCarthy's The Road is way more in line with The Last of Us than it is with Fallout in terms of how it handles the apocalypse, but somebody would probably yell at me in the comments if I left it out, so there you go. Hey, speaking of which, what did I leave out? I dug up a big glow-in-the-dark pile of radioactive fiction to keep you all busy with until Fallout, but there is so much more out there. Please let me know your suggestions in the comments. We can all share things with each other and have a good time. On that note, I'm gonna go lock myself in a vault until Fallout 4 drops. See you guys later.